"Just Grandma on the night shift again," one of the residents said, not bothering to lower her voice as Danielle Ross pushed the crash cart past the nursing station on the 7th floor. The younger nurse, couldn't have been more than 26, turned to her friend and grinned. "My mom's age. Probably couldn't hack med school." Danielle didn't slow down. Didn't look back. The fluorescent lights hummed their mechanical song overhead as she navigated the corridor with a kind of invisible efficiency that made people forget she existed the moment she walked past. This was the skill she perfected over 3 weeks, moving through Mercy General in Atlanta like she was part of the hospital's infrastructure, as essential and unremarkable as the ventilation system. The crash cart wheel squeaked softly against the tile. She restocked the defibrillator pads, checked the epinephrine doses, verified each medication bottle was exactly where it needed to be. Her hands moved with the kind of precision that only came from having done this 10,000 times before, though not always in a hospital. Not always with equipment labeled in English. The night shift suited her. 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. The halls emptied out after visiting hours, the chatter died down, and the hospital became something else entirely, a darker, quieter version of itself where only the genuinely sick remained and only the nurses who actually cared stayed awake to watch them. The residents and attending physicians who worked days had no idea what the nights actually looked like. They didn't know that half the night nurses were running on fumes and spite and the simple fact that someone had to be there when the monitors started screaming. Danielle had been there when monitors screamed in places that didn't have monitors at all. Places where screaming was a luxury. But that was a different Danielle, and she'd left that version of herself in a valley in eastern Afghanistan 7 years ago. Her shift had started at 10:45 p.m., 15 minutes of overlap with the day crew so they could hand off the critical information no computer could capture. Dr. Pierce, head of the hospital's veteran care unit, surgeon with a reputation that somehow preceded him into every room, had been the one to brief her on the assignments. His eyes had done that thing they always did when he looked at her, a quick flick of dismissal, the kind of glance you give to furniture you're not actually seeing. She was background noise in his hospital. Competent enough to keep beds cleaned and patients medicated, invisible enough that she never asked questions about why some of those medication dosages seemed to shift in ways that didn't match the patient charts. The 7th floor held post-operative cardiac cases and trauma recovery patients. Stable enough to not need ICU-level monitoring. She'd start her rounds on 8, work her way down through 6 and 5. Routine. Predictable. Safe. It was at 11:13 p.m. when she found room for 12. The door was half closed, the room beyond dark except for the pale blue glow of the cardiac monitor. She pushed the door open quietly, checking the chart on the clip outside, Major Carson Webb. 43 years old. Admitted 4 days ago following complications from spinal cord injury sustained 14 months prior. Paralyzed from the waist down. No visitors listed. No emergency contact marked as primary. The man in the bed was thin, the kind of thin that came from months of lying down, muscles atrophying despite the physical therapy notes scattered throughout his chart. His face was angular, weathered, the skin around his eyes marked with the kind of lines that came from squinting into desert sun or studying maps by firelight or watching men die. The monitors showed a heart rate in the high 60s, blood pressure stable, oxygen saturation at 98%. Clinically, he was fine. Clinically meant nothing. Danielle stepped into the room and something inside her chest locked. The eyes opened. They were grey-blue, the color of a sky before a storm, and they looked at her with the immediate alertness of someone trained to assess threats and allies in microseconds. He tracked her movement as she approached the bed, watching her hands, her posture, the way her boots moved across the tile floor. "Checking on you," she said quietly. Her voice came out careful, deferential. The voice she'd been using for 3 weeks. "How are you feeling?" "Fine," he said. His voice was rough from disuse. "Been fine for hours." She checked his full line. Saline drip, steady flow. No antibiotics running, which meant his wound was healing clean. She made a notation on the chart. Standard vitals check. Nothing unusual. Nothing that would draw attention. But as she turned to leave, something flickered across his face. Not recognition exactly. Something like the ghost of it. "Your name?" he asked. "Danielle," she said. It was the truth. Just not the whole truth. "I'm on nights." She left before he could ask anything else. The next 4 hours passed in the rhythm of the night shift, blood pressure checks at midnight, medication administration at 2 a.m., another round of vitals at 4. She moved between rooms, responding to call buttons, charting everything in the computer system, existing in the space between visibility and invisibility. The residents were long gone. Most of the day nurses had clocked out. The hospital had that particular quality of silence that only came when the sun was gone and most of the world was sleeping. At 3:15 a.m., she passed Dr. Pierce's office on the way down to the medication dispensary. The door was open. He sat hunched over his desk, the glow of the computer screen casting his face in blue-white light. Multiple patient charts were open on the monitor. She watched for only a moment, the shift of his eyes between screens, the careful way his finger moved to adjust a dosage number in one file, then moved to match it in another file, then moved back to the first. A pattern. Deliberate. Careful. Their eyes met for exactly 1 second. Danielle didn't stop walking. Didn't change her pace. Didn't give him anything at all except her continued motion down the hallway toward the medication dispensary. She pulled her ID card through the reader, entered the secure room, retrieved the medication she needed for her remaining patients. Everything exactly as it should be. Everything by protocol. But when she returned to room for 12 at 4 a.m. for the routine vitals check, she lingered longer than necessary. Major Webb was awake. "You were at FOB Shank," he said. "Not a question." Danielle's hand stopped moving for 0.3 seconds. Just a pause. Just a moment. The kind of thing no one trained in observation would miss, and Major Carson Webb had spent 21 years being trained in observation. "I'm not sure what you mean, sir," she said. Her voice remained even. Neutral. The voice of a night shift nurse who didn't want trouble. "I know your son," he said quietly. "Michael Ross. Sergeant. Bravo Company. He was with me at Coincidental. He talked about his mother every single day. Said she was a medic. Best in the battalion." The room went so quiet you could hear the ventilator in the next room over, could hear the distant beep of another cardiac monitor down the hall. Danielle's fingers found the challenge coin in her scrub pocket, tarnished silver, worn edges, the insignia from 3rd Battalion worn almost smooth from 17 years of being carried, touched, rolled between nervous fingers during moments that required absolute composure. "I don't know your son," she said. But her jaw tightened, imperceptibly. Almost imperceptibly. "I'll be back at 6 for your morning check." She left before he could say anything else. The next 3 days, Danielle found herself reassigned. Friday the 7th floor. Saturday the 4th floor. Sunday back to 7th but a completely different set of rooms. Her schedule was scattered like someone had thrown the pieces across a calendar and let them land where they would. She understood what this meant. She understood that being seen was dangerous. Being recognized was worse. But every night, no matter which floor she was assigned to, she found her way to room for 12. The first time was at 2:19 a.m. She told herself she was just checking that his call button was within reach, that his water pitcher was full, that he wasn't experiencing any pain that needed managing. Clinical reasons. Professional reasons. Nothing that required explanation. His eyes opened as soon as she entered the room. "Michael's alive," she said quietly. Not a question. She was asking. "Is he?" "Discharged 2 years ago," Major Webb said. "Good man. Solid soldier. He got out before the nightmares had nightmares." Danielle's throat tightened, but her hands remained perfectly steady as she adjusted his full line. "That's good. He talked about you every day for 6 months after," Webb continued. "Then one day he just stopped. Said his mother was dead. The silence stretched between them like something alive. She didn't correct him. Didn't offer explanation. The Danielle from Coincidental Valley was dead. The one who existed now, in this hospital, in these scrubs, was something else entirely. Something quieter. Something that moved through the world like a ghost. "I should let you rest," she said. But she came back the next night. And the night after that. The pattern established itself. Danielle would make her rounds, complete her charting, and somewhere between 3 and 4 in the morning, when the hospital was at its quietest, she would find her way to room for 12. Most nights, Major Webb was awake, as if he'd been waiting for her. She never stayed long. 5 minutes. 10, if no one else needed her. Just long enough to check his vitals, to ensure he was being treated with something approaching dignity, to be present in a way that the day staff had clearly decided he wasn't worth. The night nurse's notes made it clear Major Webb was difficult. He required extensive care. He was too much work for a standard floor rotation. His call button went unanswered for stretches that alarmed Danielle every time she reviewed his chart. 3 hours at one point. 4 hours at another. The kind of abandonment that happened when a patient was labeled as not worth the effort. On Wednesday of the second week, Danielle sat in her car in the Mercy General parking lot at 8 a.m., waiting for shift change, and rolled the challenge coin between her fingers in the pre-dawn darkness. The metal was cold, smooth. One side bore the insignia of the 75th Ranger Regiment. The other was worn almost featureless from 17 years of hands gripping it during moments that required absolute control. She had left that life behind. She had burned the bridges, changed her name in every way that mattered, built something new and quiet and safe. She had become someone who could exist in hospital corridors without drawing attention, without being seen, without being remembered. But Coincidental Valley didn't let people go. It followed you. It showed up in the eyes of men who'd been there, men who recognized the way you moved, the way your hands never shook during a crisis, the way you assessed a medical situation, the way soldiers assess a tactical one. She was being careful. She was being invisible. She was doing everything right. But the way Major Webb looked at her every night, like he was watching someone rise from the dead, suggested that invisibility had an expiration date, and she was running out of time. The room went dead silent when Dr. Pierce's voice cut through the packed cafeteria at 11:08 a.m., loud enough that the entire surgical wing looked up from their trays. 15 staff members. 23 minutes into the lunch rush. The fluorescent lights above cast everything in that particular institutional glow that made even good people look a little bit cruel. He stood near the coffee station, hands in his pockets, the posture of a man who owned the space around him, and announced it like he was calling odds at a racetrack. "I'm taking bets. Grandma Ross quits by Friday. She's been shuffled through 4 floors in 3 weeks and can't handle basic rotations. $20 says she's gone by end of shift." Laughter rippled through a cluster of younger nurses, residents mostly, the kind who still believed that cruelty was currency, that watching someone break was entertainment. Danielle stood at the beverage station, pouring coffee with a hand that didn't shake, a hand that had held a tourniquet on a femoral artery in a dust storm while mortar rounds walked closer. She poured. The coffee steamed. She didn't turn around. Her jaw tightened imperceptibly, just the faintest muscle contraction along the line of her mandible, but her face remained the kind of blank that came from 20 years of practice. The kind of composure that cost something every single time. Muscle memory kept her steady. Not the muscle memory of a nurse. The muscle memory of someone who'd learned that showing pain was the same as bleeding in front of sharks. She raised the cup to her lips and drank, alone at a corner table, while Pierce held court like he'd just landed the best joke in Georgia. The challenge coin in her scrub pocket felt heavier than usual. She could feel it through the fabric, that worn tarnished metal from Coincidental Valley, the one she'd carried since her medical discharge. The one she rolled between her fingers when she couldn't sleep. The one she kept wrapped in gauze in her car, hidden in the wheel well where nobody would ever find it. She drank her coffee and felt the weight of invisibility, the particular heaviness of being dismissed by people who had no idea who they were dismissing. 3 weeks. That's how long Pierce had been moving her between floors: pediatric wing, outpatient clinic, night shift on a floor 3 buildings away from the veteran care unit where Major Webb lay in room for 12, slowly being abandoned by a system that had decided his case was too complicated. 3 weeks of reassignments. 3 weeks of memo citing Hospital Policy 7.3.2 and staffing optimization. 3 weeks of watching the gap between Danielle and the one man in this hospital who might recognize her grow wider with each shift rotation. Then came the cafeteria. 12:34 p.m. Lunch rush hitting its peak. The kind of crowded where nobody makes direct eye contact, where every surface holds trays and elbows, and the kind of noise that makes it easy to pretend you didn't see something. Pierce approached her table with the theatrical slowness of someone savoring an audience. He examined her tray with exaggerated disgust: soup, sandwich, apple, like she'd offered him spoiled meat. His voice dropped, the way it did when he wanted to sound confidential, the way that made it worse because nearby staff could hear every word. "Still eating here? Thought you'd have figured out you don't belong." Then he reached down and knocked the tray from the table with the back of his hand. A casual motion. Practiced. The kind of thing that would look like an accident if anyone was inclined to believe it. Soup spilled across the tile in a rust-colored stain. The sandwich landed face down. Utensils clattered with the kind of noise that made the whole cafeteria freeze for exactly 1 second before staff members suddenly became very focused on their own food, their own conversations, their own desperate desire not to be involved. The room held its breath. Danielle's jaw tightened imperceptibly. Just that. No trembling hands, no face burning red, no retreat to a supply closet. She knelt immediately, began gathering the scattered papers that had tumbled from her tray. Her hands moved with mechanical precision, steady, practiced, the hands of someone who'd learned long ago that showing frustration was a luxury she couldn't afford. She picked up each piece. The sandwich. The apple. The napkin soaked through with broth. Around her, the cafeteria began to move again, conversations resuming, but everyone was listening. Everyone was watching without appearing to watch. That was the real cruelty of it, the collective pretense that this wasn't happening, that Danielle Ross wasn't on her knees gathering the remnants of a humiliation staged for an audience that refused to acknowledge it. She didn't flinch. She didn't blink. She gathered. Pierce stood above her, hands in pockets, the smile of someone who'd just confirmed that he could break anyone he wanted to break. "You need help." The voice came from an orderly she didn't recognize, a black man in blue scrubs, maybe 55, the kind of person who worked in hospitals long enough to develop a conscience. His tone was neutral, which made the offer itself an accusation against Pierce. Danielle shook her head once. "I've got it." Her voice was steady, not cold, not defiant, just flat and level like a plumb line. She finished gathering. She stood. She walked to the trash bin. She disposed of the remnants of her lunch while the cafeteria pretended not to be watching her dispose of her dignity in front of them. The orderly looked at Pierce with an expression that said something. Pierce didn't care. He turned and walked away, satisfied, the particular satisfaction of a predator who'd found prey that wouldn't fight back. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part came 3 days later when Pierce began the documentation campaign. She'd been reassigned to the night shift on the 5th floor, pediatric neurology, as far from the veteran care unit as geography would allow. The rotation made it impossible to check on Major Webb except during the brief window when shift change happened at 7 p.m., when coverage gaps opened up like doors nobody was watching. Pierce filed his first incident report on a Monday at 3:14 a.m. She'd helped a post-op patient who was having difficulty with his catheter. Nothing outside scope. Routine care. But Pierce had been reviewing footage, security footage that he apparently had discretionary access to, and he filed a complaint citing Hospital Regulation 7.3.2 about documentation protocols, claiming Danielle had failed to note the interaction in the chart. The next report came 2 days later. This time it was about medication distribution. She'd flagged a discrepancy in the narcotic count on the veteran care floor, a small variance that suggested either documentation error or inventory loss. She'd reported it up the chain, exactly as protocol demanded. Pierce cited her for overstepping chain of command authority and violating Section 4.1.7 of hospital policy. Each complaint was meticulous. Each one was technically defensible. Each one built a paper trail that looked like evidence of a nurse who didn't understand her limitations. Danielle kept showing up. On time. Every shift. Uniform perfect. Hair pulled back the way it should be. Hands clean. The picture of professional compliance. But alone in her car at 2 a.m., parked in the garage where the security cameras had blind spots, she gripped the steering wheel until her knuckles went white and her breathing came in hard, controlled pulls. The kind of breathing you did when you were trying not to scream. The challenge coin felt like it weighed 5 pounds in her pocket. She'd roll it between her fingers, click, 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 the metal catching on her calluses. 20 years of controlled anger. 20 years of swallowing humiliation. 20 years of being invisible while staying alive. And now there was this. Dr. Pierce. A hospital that didn't want to see her. And a man in room for 12 who was slowly being erased by a system that had decided paralyzed veterans were inconvenient. She'd started mapping Pierce's schedule. Tuesday and Thursday he did rounds between 8 a.m. and 10 a.m. He took lunch at 12:30. He left the hospital most nights by 6 p.m. That left windows. Small ones. Maybe 30 seconds here, 90 seconds there. Enough time to check on web. Enough time to see what condition he was actually in beneath the paperwork that said everything was fine. She'd begun her own quiet documentation, mental notes of his respiratory rate, his oxygen saturation, the pallor of his skin, the way his eyes tracked her when she appeared in his doorway. Webb had been a major once. Before the IED outside Jalabad. Before his world had compressed to 4 walls and the ceiling of his room. Before the doctors decided his case was too much work. She knew him from somewhere she wouldn't admit, from a place she'd left behind, from a file that didn't officially exist anymore. Her son's commanding officer. The man who'd brought her boy home alive from Korengal Valley. That was why she kept checking. That was why the reassignments felt like a personal erasure. That was why every notice from Pierce felt like a violation of something sacred. And then came the moment in the cafeteria that changed everything. Or seemed to. Seemed to mean something final. It was 1:02 p.m. on a Thursday. The lunch crowd had thinned. Danielle was at her table again, alone, because the other nurses had stopped sitting near her, either from fear of association or fear of her, she couldn't tell which. Pierce appeared with Major Webb's patient chart in his hand. He approached slowly, the way he always did, gathering an audience with just his presence. Then he dropped the chart at her feet. Paper scattered across the tile like confetti. Danielle's jaw tightened. Just that. Pick that up, sweetheart. The word sweetheart landed like a slap. Drawn out. Contemptuous. Since you're so concerned about the difficult cases. 2 residents snickered behind him. One of them, a surgeon named Kavanaugh, whispered something that made the other one smile. Danielle knelt. She gathered each page methodically. Her hands were perfectly steady. Her face betrayed nothing. And that's when she realized something had changed. When she'd knelt before, her knees had trembled slightly. Her breathing had hitched. Just a little. Just enough for someone watching carefully to see that she was human, that she could be broken. This time, her knees were rock solid. This time, her breathing came like a metronome. This time, when she looked up at Pierce while gathering his scattered papers, the look in her eyes was the kind of look that made the other resident stop smiling. Just for a second. Just long enough for them to realize they had no idea who they were watching humiliate. She picked up every page. The chart reassembled itself in her hands like it was second nature, like she'd been trained to restore order from chaos, which she had been, just not in any way that hospital paperwork could track. She stood, holding the intact chart, and Pierce extended his hand to take it back. For a moment that lasted longer than it should have, Danielle held the chart against her chest. Their eyes met. His were the color of pale ice. Hers were the color of something that had learned to survive by going completely still. Then she handed him the chart, and she said nothing, and Pierce smiled because he thought he'd won. Because he had no idea that the woman standing in front of him had spent 20 years learning how to bide her time. How to wait. How to be invisible until invisibility became irrelevant. That night, at 2 a.m., in her car in the parking garage, she pulled out the challenge coin and held it under the dome light and read the inscription she'd long ago memorized, Coincidental Valley. 2009, Captain D. Ross. We remember. The schedule changed on a Tuesday. 3 buildings away. Night shift to pediatric wing, then outpatient clinic on the 4th floor, then back to nights but in a different tower entirely. Danielle read the roster printed from the hospital intranet and felt the weight of it immediately, not in her chest, but in her hands. The challenge coin in her scrub pocket suddenly felt heavier. She turned the paper over, checking twice. Room for 12. Major Webb. The veteran care unit was no longer her assignment. Dr. Pierce had done this methodically. She understood the architecture of his thinking because she'd spent 23 years watching men like him operate in organizations where authority moved through channels instead of command structures. He couldn't fire her outright, not yet. No, he was building something more elegant. He was isolating her. Fragmenting her access. Making her absence from Webb's care look like logistics instead of sabotage. By the time he made his move, there would be a paper trail 3 inches thick explaining why Captain Danielle Ross was no longer qualified to work the veteran ward, why her reassignments were routine, why her termination was inevitable and necessary and completely justified. She studied the schedule in the break room while the other nurses discussed their shifts. Nobody noticed her. That was the point of being invisible. You could read the architecture of your own destruction and the room wouldn't even know you were looking. Pediatric wing started Saturday. Outpatient the following Monday. Then back to nights, effective immediately, on the South Tower, 3rd floor. They'd given her the behavioral health unit. The irony was sharp enough to taste. She folded the paper and slipped it into her pocket next to the coin. The system was perfect. With her reassigned to 3 different floors in the span of 10 days, checking on Webb would require her to walk across half the hospital. Security badges logged every door. Supervisors tracked the time she spent on each floor. If she made sudden trips to the veteran care unit, her old floor, the one she was no longer assigned to, it would look like insubordination. Wandering out of her assigned area. Breaking protocol. More documentation for Pierce's file. She'd worked long enough in military medicine to recognize this kind of siege. It wasn't about one big explosion. It was erosion. Reduce access, increase documentation, wait for the mistake that was inevitable once you'd cut someone off from what mattered most. And Webb mattered. She thought about his paralyzed hands, his liquid blue eyes tracking the ceiling because it was all he could move. She thought about the extended absence she'd noted on his chart the week before, a 4-hour stretch where the assigned nurse had taken lunch and nobody covered. He'd been alone. Completely alone. His call button unanswered. Friday night, her last shift on the veteran ward before the reassignments took hold, Danielle walked room for 12 and found Wegg's breathing pattern shallower than before. His oxygen sat at 92. Normal, technically, but lower than his baseline. She adjusted the flow, checked his lines, and leaned down so he could see her face. "I'm going to be reassigned," she said. Her voice stayed level. "Different floors. But I will check on you." Webb's eyes moved. That was all he had, the eyes, and the ventilator's hiss, and the soft beeping of monitors arranged around him like a mechanical church. He couldn't speak past the breathing tube. Couldn't move. Couldn't signal. But his eyes held hers for 4 full seconds, and she knew he understood. She made a decision then. The kind that senior officers make in field hospitals at 3 in the morning, when protocols and regulations and career advancement become less real than the person in front of you. She started memorizing the night schedule. Not just her shifts, but the other nurses' shifts. The charge nurse's pattern. The times when the veteran ward was skeletal, when coverage was thin and reassignments created gaps. The pediatric wing was pastel and loud. Crying babies, anxious parents, a different kind of medicine entirely. Danielle worked 3 days and watched the clock. The outpatient clinic was worse, fluorescent, administrative, filled with people who'd never seen combat or trauma or the kind of injuries that remake a human body into something that only moves its eyes. She documented everything she was supposed to document. She was professional, efficient, invisible. The younger nurses still didn't talk to her. That was fine. She needed to be a ghost. On the night of March 14th, she noticed something in the schedule that made her stop. The assigned nurse for the veteran ward, a woman named Jennifer who was competent but overextended, had been given an extended break the following Tuesday night. For hours, listed right there in the rotation. 4 p.m. to 8 p.m. The charge nurse would be in the office handling admissions. Danielle would be on the South Tower, 3rd floor, with behavioral health. Webb would have a call button and no one to answer it. She understood then. Pierce wasn't just isolating her. He was creating the conditions for something to happen. Something that would be documented. Something that would confirm whatever narrative he'd already constructed. And then, when she violated protocol to help, which she would, because that's what people do when the alternative is letting someone die, he would have her. The week crawled. Pediatric rotations bled into night shifts. She found herself standing at odd times in the break room, refreshing the staff schedule on her phone, watching the assignments shift and solidify. Her final shift in pediatrics was Monday. Her first shift in behavioral health was Wednesday. Tuesday night, she was off. Off the schedule. Not assigned anywhere. Available, theoretically, to do whatever she wanted. She spent Tuesday morning running 12 miles through the residential neighborhoods west of Atlanta, past houses with manicured lawns and cars in driveways, past people living lives that required no decisions about who to save and when. Her knees ached. Her left hip, where the shrapnel had settled against the sciatic nerve, sent pain down her calf in rhythm with her footfalls. Pain was information. Pain meant she was still functioning. Still moving. Still in the game. That night, she sat in the parking lot of Mercy General in her 8-year-old Corolla and waited for her phone to show 11:02 p.m. The challenge coin sat on the dashboard, tarnished silver catching the light from the street lamps. She rolled it between her fingers while the minutes crawled. Jennifer's shift would be ending soon. The charge nurse would be deep in paperwork. The night shift would be skeleton crew, stretched thin across 12 floors. At 1:08 a.m., Danielle received a text from an unknown number. 3 words, for 12. Now. Blue. She moved before she finished reading. The coin went into her pocket. The car door opened with a quiet click. The hospital after midnight had its own rhythm, different from days, emptier but sharper somehow, like the whole building held its breath. She used her badge to access the South Tower stairwell and climbed 3 flights, her boots silent on the concrete. Muscle memory took over. Her hands were steady. Her breathing controlled. She wasn't a nurse slipping protocols. She was a soldier moving through terrain. The veteran ward doors hissed open. The hall was dim, emergency lighting only. Webb's room was at the far end. Danielle covered it in 30 seconds, her mind already running through the differential, elevated breathing rate, visible distension, likely tension situation given the clinical presentation and the timing. Her eyes read the monitor before she reached the bed. Oxygen saturation 84 and dropping. Heart rate 118. His lips were blue-tinged. His neck veins were bulging like rope. Every muscle in his chest was rigid, his breathing shallow and ineffective. Tension pneumothorax. Air in the pleural space with no way out. The pressure building with every breath until the lung collapsed and the heart couldn't fill and the whole system began to fail. Danielle was moving. Her hands found the crash cart. Her eyes located the 14-gauge angiocatheter. The antiseptic pad came out of her pocket. She'd started carrying them weeks ago, a quiet breach of protocol that had felt ridiculous until this moment. She prepped the second intercostal space, midclavicular line, muscle memory handling the anatomy like it was written in her bones. Because it was. 23 years of field medicine lived in her hands. The needle went in. The catheter followed. And then the sound, that specific, unmistakable hiss of air escaping under pressure. The release. The decompression. Webb's chest fell visibly. His lips went from blue to pink in 4 seconds. The oxygen monitor climbed. 86, 88. 90, his breathing deepened, found rhythm. Step away from that patient. Dr. Pierce stood in the doorway. His phone was already in his hand, already recording. His face was pale, his jaw tight, his entire bearing arranged around the fact that he was watching his strategy implode in real time. Danielle didn't turn. Her eye stayed on Webb's monitor. O2 sat at 92 now. Climbing. Safe. She could feel Pierce's presence like a weight in the room, like the air pressure had changed with his arrival. When she finally turned, she was already setting the catheter kit on the bedside table. Already positioning herself between Webb and the door with the kind of casual certainty that comes from having made decisions about life and death while people screamed around you. "I'm documenting this," Pierce said. His voice was different now, sharp, controlled, but underneath it something else. Fear. He'd understood in that moment what she was. "You are not assigned to this patient. You are not authorized for this floor. Step away. Now." He was crashing, Danielle said. Her voice was quiet. Even. Tension pneumothorax. ETA for response team would have been 4 minutes. He had 90 seconds before cardiac arrest. "I don't care. You violated protocol. You practiced beyond your scope. You performed a physician's procedure without authorization, and I am photographing this as evidence." Pierce raised his phone, already snapping images of the equipment, the catheter, the documentation. Danielle walked past him. Not around him. Past him. Her shoulder didn't touch his, but it was close enough that he had to step back, had to cede space, had to realize in that moment that standing between her and the door wasn't a viable strategy anymore. "Call whoever you need to call," she said. She didn't look back. But his breathing. The hallway was empty. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like insects. Danielle walked toward the stairwell with her hand steady and her eyes forward, and the weight of every decision she'd made in the last 3 weeks suddenly arriving at once. By morning, there would be incident reports. 3 of them, filed in sequence, building a case. Practicing beyond scope. Unauthorized procedures. Dangerous autonomous behavior. All documented. All photographed. All the evidence Pierce needed to justify what came next. She sat in her car in the parking lot as the sky began to lighten and let herself understand that she'd just ended her career at Mercy General. She'd saved Webb's life. She'd done exactly what any soldier would do when someone was dying. And she'd handed Pierce the paperwork he needed to make sure she paid for it. The needle went in. Midclavicular line, second intercostal space. Danielle's hands moved with the precision of someone who had performed this procedure under fire, not fluorescent hospital lights, but the physics of a pneumothorax didn't care about the setting. 14-gauge angiocath. The hiss of air escaping from Major Webb's chest, that was the sound of pressure releasing, of a man's collapsed lung beginning to re-expand, of the difference between death and the next breath. 60 seconds elapsed. Webb's oxygen saturation climbed. 68, 72. 79, his lips lost their blue tinge. The panic in his eyes softened into something almost like recognition, not of her, but of salvation arriving in scrubs instead of a medevac helicopter. Danielle kept her hand steady on the catheter, monitoring the flow, her other hand checking his pulse. Strong. Getting stronger. Her voice came out level, Clinical, you're going to be okay. Stay with me. 85 seconds. She reached for her phone to call the code, to summon the attending physician who should have been monitoring this patient all along, but the door to room for 12 had already opened. Dr. Pierce stood in the threshold, and he was holding his own phone. Not calling for help. Recording. His face carried the expression of a man who had just watched his nemesis hand him a weapon. You're not assigned to this patient, Pierce said, his voice carrying the particular coldness of administrative precision. And you're certainly not authorized to perform invasive procedures. Hospital Regulation 7.3.2. Nursing scope of practice ends at assessment and notification. Danielle didn't turn from Webb. She monitored the catheter, monitored the vital signs, monitored the man whose commander had trained her son in a valley 8,000 miles away. 90 seconds. The crisis window had closed. Webb would live. Everything else, Pierce's phone, the recording, the paper trail being compiled in real time, that was secondary. Call the attending, she said quietly. Major Webb needs a chest tube and imaging. Tension pneumothorax. The decompression bought him time. Pierce didn't move. His phone remained raised, capturing her at the bedside of a patient she had no authorization to touch, performing a procedure that existed in a legally ambiguous space between emergency medicine and nursing practice, a procedure that would look, on video, exactly like an overstepping floor nurse playing doctor. This will be documented, Pierce said. She already knew it would be. The moment she'd made the decision to save Webb's life instead of waiting for someone with the correct title and credential, she'd made the decision to lose her job. Some choices had only one outcome, and she'd learned to recognize them long ago. The difference between a medic and a nurse wasn't just the uniform. It was the willingness to break rules when the alternative was a body bag. By morning, the documentation was complete. 3 separate incident reports, each meticulously constructed. The first cited her for performing a procedure outside her scope of practice, Regulation 7.3.2, clear violation, photographic evidence attached. The second cited her for patient abandonment of her assigned floor, she had left her designated unit without notification or coverage. The third cited her for insubordination when she failed to acknowledge Pierce's direct instruction to step away from the patient. The hospital's legal team reviewed the documents and found them airtight. 17 pages total. Regulatory citations. Precedent cases. A careful escalation of violations that built toward an inevitable conclusion, immediate termination for patient safety concerns. The board convened at 9 a.m. in the administrative conference room on the 3rd floor. The walls were beige. The table was glass. Danielle sat alone at one end in her final set of scrubs, blue, faded from 100 washings, the cuff fraying slightly at the wrist. She kept her hands folded. Her posture was perfect. Military bearing didn't disappear just because you changed uniforms. Pierce presented his case with the precision of a prosecutor. He walked through each regulation, each violation, each moment of her dangerous autonomous behavior. His voice never rose. He didn't need it to. The documentation spoke. The board members flipped through pages, nodded at appropriate moments, exchanged glances that said, "This is open and shut." This pattern represents a liability threat to Mercy General, Pierce concluded. She operates outside the chain of command. She endangers patient safety through cowboy medicine. The hospital cannot retain personnel who prioritize their own judgment over institutional protocol. The board chair, a woman named Hartley, CEO of the hospital's operations division, looked at Danielle across the expanse of the glass table. "Do you have anything to say?" Danielle shook her head once. That silence, that single gesture, carried more weight than any defense. It was the silence of someone who understood that explanation was impossible and justification was irrelevant. In a hospital built on protocols, she had operated on a different code entirely. Major Webb would be alive because of that code. She would be unemployed because of it. Some trades were simply the cost of doing business. The board chair reached for the vote sheet. Hands began to rise around the table. Then the double doors opened. Major Carson Webb sat in a wheelchair, oxygen line trailing behind his chair, pushed by an orderly who looked equally confused about why a recovering patient was being transported to the third floor. Webb's face was pale but conscious. His eyes scanned the room and locked on Danielle with the precision of a trained soldier finding his target. He opened his mouth. One word emerged, barely a whisper but carrying the weight of history. Valkyrie. The room froze. That night, alone in a diner called Murphy's on the corner of Peachtree and 14th, Danielle sat in a booth with torn red vinyl seats and stared at her reflection in the dark window. 3 a.m. The fluorescent lights hummed with that particular frequency that only existed in diners and hospitals, the sound of institutional loneliness. Her coffee had gone cold an hour ago. The ceramic mug sat in front of her, a ring of dried coffee marking where she'd let it rest without drinking. The tarnished challenge coin from Korengal Valley sat on the table beside her untouched slice of pie. She picked it up, turned it over in her fingers the way she'd done 10,000 times before. The metal was worn smooth where hands had rolled it, buffed and polished by muscle memory that never quit. One side bore the insignia of the 75th Ranger Regiment. The other side showed coordinates, her drop zone, the day that changed everything. 8,000 miles away. 12 years ago. A lifetime compressed into a coin the size of a quarter. The waitress, a woman in her 60s with grey streaked through her dark hair, refilled the coffee without asking. "You okay, hun?" Danielle didn't answer. Not because she was rude, but because there was no answer that made sense. She had tried to disappear into the role of nurse. She had kept her head down. She had let younger nurses dismiss her as someone who couldn't hack medical school. She had built a new identity out of scrubs and protocols and the careful invisibility of someone working the night shift. And then a paralyzed veteran had needed someone to save his life, and running from her past had simply stopped being an option. The challenge coin caught the light. For a moment she could see herself in it, not the middle-aged nurse in discount scrubs, but something older. Something that lived in the muscle memory of her hands, in the exact angle of her spine as it sat against the booth's crack back, in the way her eyes had tracked every exit the moment she'd walked through the diner's doors. She wondered if becoming invisible had always been impossible, or if she'd simply failed at it because something in her, some part that still heard the rotor wash of medevac helicopters, still remembered the weight of a soldier's life balanced on the steadiness of her hands, had been waiting for permission to be visible again. The challenge coin was heavy in her palm. So heavy that it felt like it weighed more than it should, like it carried not just metal but the accumulated mass of every choice she'd made to run, to hide, to become someone other than who she was. She rolled it between her fingers and wondered how long invisibility lasted once someone had seen you. The conference room at Mercy General sat on the 14th floor, all glass walls and mahogany, the kind of space designed to make ordinary people feel small. Danielle occupied one end of the long table, her hands folded in front of her. The board members filed in slowly, 7 of them, including the hospital administrator, 2 physician representatives, and a retired Army colonel who'd been brought in to oversee the review. A folder sat in front of each of them. Inside those folders was the documentation of her termination, already decided before she'd entered the room. They looked at her the way people look at someone already gone. The board chair cleared his throat. Colonel Mercer, his name tag read. Mid-60s, ramrod posture, the kind of bearing that came from 30 years of command. He began reading the charges from Dr. Pierce's incident reports. Practicing beyond scope. Unauthorized procedures. Dangerous autonomous behavior. The words fell like stones into still water. Each one true on its surface, each one a lie underneath. Danielle didn't blink. She'd been trained to sit still during worse things than this, to let the noise of institutional power wash over her without leaving a mark. Her challenge coin was still in her scrub pocket. She could feel its weight. Then the doors opened. They wheeled Major Webb in on a standard hospital chair, his oxygen line trailing behind him like an umbilical cord, his left arm strapped to his torso to prevent the constant involuntary spasms that had plagued him since the paralysis set in. His eyes found her immediately across the table. For 3 weeks, Danielle had moved through that hospital's corridors like a ghost, and this man who'd commanded her son into Coincidental Valley, who'd survived the same violence that had shattered his spine, had seen her every time. Had watched her work without understanding why. His lips moved. One word, whispered so softly the board members had to lean forward to hear. Valkyrie. The room shifted. Something changed in the air pressure, like the moment before a thunderstorm breaks. Colonel Mercer's expression shifted from institutional boredom to something sharper. He looked at the elderly security guard standing near the door, a man named Deshaun Willis, 68 years old, a Vietnam veteran who'd worked at Mercy General for 23 years. Willis's eyes had gone wide. He straightened up, and when he spoke, his voice came from somewhere deep and official, a parade ground voice that belonged to another era entirely. That woman is Captain Danielle Ross. Silver Star recipient. Special Forces medic. Coincidental Valley. Silence filled the room like water. 1 second. 2. The board members exchanged glances. The administrator's hand froze halfway to her water glass. Colonel Mercer leaned back in his chair, his jaw working silently. The door opened again. She walked in alone, a 2-star general in dress uniform, a woman with silver stars on her shoulders and a face that had been trained for 40 years to reveal nothing. She carried a file folder, the kind with restricted headers, the kind that made lawyers nervous. She didn't introduce herself. She didn't need to. She set the folder on the table in front of the board chair and began to read. Captain Danielle Marie Ross, 4th Battalion, Special Operations Medical Corps. Medically discharged 17 months ago. Silver Star citation. Purple Heart, 1st award. Purple Heart, 2nd award. Commendation Medal with Valor device. She was decorated for 17 combat medical interventions in hostile territory, including emergency field resuscitations of 2 tactical operations officers and a Delta team leader during the Cunha Province firefight of 2019. Each sentence landed like artillery. Each one true. Each one a piece of a puzzle nobody in that room had been assembled. The general looked directly at Major Webb. Major Webb. You're here because of what happened in Coincidental Valley. His voice was rough, damaged by 3 weeks of minimal speech and the weight of things he'd never spoken about. Yes, Captain Ross was our battalion aid station medical officer. We took contact in the valley. Incoming mortars. My helicopter was inbound for extraction. He paused, swallowed. She saw the angle of fire. Understood what was going to happen before anyone else. She moved into the blast radius. Shielded the rotor wash. His voice cracked. The shrapnel that paralyzed me went through her spine first. She saved my life by taking damage that should have killed her. The room went so quiet you could hear the air conditioning unit hum in the walls. 10 seconds of that silence. 9. 8. Then Colonel Mercer turned slowly toward Dr. Pierce, who sat 3 chairs down, his face the color of old paper. Dr. Pierce. Your incident reports required a comprehensive review of the Veteran Care Unit's procedures. In the course of that review, several anomalies were discovered. Mercer slid a different folder across the table. Inside was a wall of documentation. Pierce's hand moved toward it, trembled, and stopped. 18 months of systematic medication diversion from controlled substance logs. Altered patient charts in the pain management protocols. Missing narcotic inventory. Wire transfers to a personal account. The investigation you initiated against Captain Ross has uncovered systematic diversion of medications intended for veteran patients in your care. Pierce's mouth opened. Nothing came out. The hospital's legal counsel was already standing, already citing statutes. Criminal negligence. Breach of fiduciary duty. Distribution of controlled substances beyond medical scope. The words piled up like sandbags against a rising tide. The board voted in 12 minutes. Unanimous dismissal of Pierce's medical privileges. Criminal referral to the Atlanta Police Department. License suspension pending investigation. The weapon he'd built to destroy her had turned inward and annihilated him instead. They escorted him out. Willis walked him to the door with the kind of courtesy reserved for the condemned, professional, detached, the way military personnel handle the dishonoured. Pierce looked back once, directly at Danielle, searching her face for something. Satisfaction. Anger. Triumph. He found none of it. She was expressionless, hands still folded, exactly as she'd been when he'd tried to humiliate her in the cafeteria 3 weeks ago. Her composure had been her armor all along. It was the same armor now. The board chair turned to Danielle. Colonel Mercer's voice softened into something that resembled respect. Captain Ross, I'm authorized to offer you reinstatement to your position with full back pay, a formal written apology from this institution, and a request for permanent assignment to the Veteran Care Unit if you're willing to accept it. He paused. Are you? Danielle nodded. One motion. One word. Yes. The 2-star general asked if she'd ever considered returning to active medical consultation. Danielle said she'd think about it. Major Webb wheeled closer, close enough that she could see the tremor in his hands, the way his eyes held relief and recognition and years of accumulated respect finally spoken aloud. Welcome back, Valkyrie, he said quietly. She allowed herself the smallest nod. 18 months later, Danielle walked through Mercy General's main entrance at 11 p.m., her shift starting in 7 minutes. She wore her scrubs as always, but the tarnished challenge coin was no longer hidden in her pocket. It hung openly on her lanyard, displayed next to her RN credentials and the new badge that designated her as lead nurse on the Veteran Care Unit. Her hair was shorter now, pulled back in a tight bun. Her movements had a precision that newer staff had begun to notice, an efficiency that bordered on tactical. She'd been promoted 3 months ago. The veteran ward was now a model program, cited in nursing journals, studied by hospital administrators from 3 states away. Room for 12 had been redesigned entirely, recalibrated as a model for patient-centered trauma recovery. Major Webb had been transferred to an advanced rehabilitation facility in Savannah where he was regaining partial motor function. He sent her updates every month, pages of handwriting that took him hours now, but hours he was willing to spend. As Danielle crossed the main lobby, she passed the night security desk. The man sitting there was Dr. Henry Pierce. Age 51 now, though he looked older. His uniform was gray, generic, the kind worn by night security personnel at hospitals across the country. He monitored the camera feeds, checked badges, sat in the same lobby he'd once commanded like a kingdom. Unable to prescribe. Unable to practice. Unable to wield institutional power. When he saw Danielle approaching, his eyes dropped immediately. He could not hold her gaze. She walked past without acknowledgement, without breaking stride, as if he'd become exactly what he'd always tried to make her, invisible. In the elevator, alone, she allowed herself the smallest smile. Upstairs on the 13th floor, a new admission had arrived during the day shift. A young Marine, 24 years old, with complex trauma and severe behavioral complications. His chart indicated he'd already been labeled difficult by the day nurses, the kind of patient that made staff avoid his room, minimize contact, hope his family would arrange transfer somewhere else. Danielle took the chart and walked to his room without hesitation. She introduced herself. Checked his vitals. Adjusted his position for comfort. And stayed. She sat in the chair beside his bed and didn't leave. The work continued, as it always did. In the quiet hours of the night shift, when the fluorescent lights hummed their monotonous song and the hospital settled into the rhythms of recovery and loss, Captain Danielle Ross sat with the abandoned and held space for the broken. She moved through those corridors as someone who understood pain, who recognized it, who'd spent her life translating its language. The challenge coin on her lanyard caught the light as she moved from room to room, a small tarnished reminder that the quietest person in any room might just be the one holding it all together. True class is what you do when the lights go out. If you found yourself rooting for Danielle from the moment she took that first quiet step through Mercy General's doors, I want to hear from you. What would you have done if you'd been in her position? If you had that kind of secret, that kind of strength, that kind of reason to stay silent, would you have stayed hidden? Like this video if it reminded you that the most dangerous people are often the ones who don't advertise their power. Subscribe to see more stories about the ones who serve in silence. And drop a comment below. Have you ever been completely misjudged by someone in a position of authority, only to have the truth come out later? Your story matters.